Today we're going to be discussing lead paint. And to be honest with you, it's kind of one of those topics. It's like, why should we really care about it? It may sound silly, but most people don't know that much about lead-based paint, including myself. So I felt like this would be a great topic to really discuss. And it's something where I sell a lot of homes, older homes built prior to 1978, where they certainly could have lead-based paint in them. But no one really ever tests for the lead-based paint in my area. We have rental laws that people will go in and they'll test for lead just because it is a requirement for rental properties, but not when you buy or sell a home. So why should we care about it? What are the effects of lead-based paint? What are they? How do you remove it? So my guest today is the perfect person to talk to about this topic. She is a national lead paint expert, and she is a trainer on lead paint certifications. She's going to tell us why we should care about it and, what the effects are and how to remove it. So welcome, Kate Kirkwood. Hi, Kate.
Thank you, Patti. Hi.
So I know you've written several books actually on this topic of lead paint, and you also did a TEDx talk about it. So there was one in particular that you wrote about. It's a children's book on lead paint. So can you kind of walk us through, what happens with children in lead paint?
Absolutely. So we've known for a long time in this country that lead paint is a potential problem. In fact, where I live in Manchester, New Hampshire, we actually had a child poisoned and died of lead paint, a 2-year-old in the year 2000. That's the most recent death in decades in this country. And so we've become very aware of it here in New England. But anyway, the death is obviously the most extreme case. But what happens to these children if they are exposed to lead dust prior to the age of 6? Their brains are still in development. And so what ends up happening is that they actually lose IQ points. Their brain is damaged by the lead in such a way that they have learning disabilities, they have ADHD, they have hearing loss, speech disorders, many neurological problems, many brain problems, as well as some physical problems as well. And so the children that are exposed have virtually always end up in some sort of a long-term problem, long-term situation. And we have some experts estimate 1 in about 30 children poisoned in America today.
Wow. So what is the greatest cause, or not even cause, what is the greatest access? Is it lead-based paint, like peeling paint in old homes, or is it the dust that you're talking about, like working in a home that has lead-based paint?
Right. Great question. So I think that's what most people think. I think people believe that if a child is lead poisoned, they must have been peeling paint off the wall and eating it, or chewing on the windowsill, that kind of thing. But the truth is that's very rare. I've now met hundreds of lead poisoned children over the years, and maybe a handful, maybe 3 or 4 actually ate the paint. That's very unusual. Most of the time what it is that they are breathing in these little bits of dust. So you live in an old home, you open and close those old windows, and the friction of that sash rubbing up against the jam area creates these tiny little bits of dust, really too small to see. And then the child breathes it in. And lead dust being heavy settles down on the floor. So the babies crawling around on the floor, especially if there's carpet, which really traps that little dust, they get their hands in it. And then, children, their hands are constantly in their mouths. And so we end up with they eat it or they breathe it. Those are really the 2 ways that they get poisoned. And the dust is not just created by windows. I mean, that's an easy example for people, but anytime there's old paint in the home, there's a likelihood that it's being broken into little bits and pieces by walking on it, by brushing up against it, by banging furniture against the baseboards or the chair rails or whatever. And a lot of the decorative elements in the old home, while beautiful, they really lend themselves to that kind of deterioration.
Yeah, so like a lot of the wood that starts to deteriorate, the crown molding, all those types of things. So are there certain ages of homes? Now, you're in the New England area. I'd imagine there's a lot of 1800s homes, even older, 1800s, early 1900s. Are there periods of time? It seems like by the 50s and 60s, is there statistically a lot less lead-based paint? Just curious.
Yes.
It seems to me that would be the case.
hmm So, and don't let me forget too to come back and talk about the book. You asked me, and I kind of jumped past it talking about the kids. But yeah, there's I work nationally, and so the HUD data is very clear. Houses built before 1940, 87% of them have lead paint. So 9 out of 10 houses, if they were built before 1940. Now, when we get down into say 1940 to 1960, it's more like 70%. And then 1960 to 1978, about 25%. So 78 is where we stopped, supposedly we stopped using it in homes. It's not really the case. What we did was we stopped manufacturing it for residential use. But people still had paint left over that they used, and hardware stores still had stock that they sold. So we did have lead paint in homes after 1978, but very few.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why do you suppose, and I know we're jumping around just a little bit, but I don't want to forget to ask this question, but why do you suppose there isn't a requirement nationally then, if it's that the effects can be so harmful that it isn't mandatory? Like I said, I sell a lot of homes in Maryland, and just as far as sales go, people buying homes that are older, they just never test for lead.
Right. So I think that's regional, because I'm where I am in New England. I hold 7 different lead licenses. I'm a lead abatement contractor, worker supervisor, trainer, all that stuff. And among those licenses, I have been a lead inspector and risk assessor over the years. And we do get calls fairly often from a buyer, typically asking that we do a lead inspection on a home before they buy it. And some realtors and some sellers actually will request one ahead of time, sort of the way you would you would give a buyer advice about other things that they might want to address. Sometimes we do see realtors suggesting, if you had an inspection done, if everything is safe, then we can prove it. Mm-hmm. And if it's not safe, we can get an idea what that cost looks like, and then we're kind of ahead of it. We're adding some value. We actually have some markets in New England where it definitely adds to the value of the house, both as a rental and as a purchase, if we can have a lead safe certificate on the property. And the way it works in most of the country, if a child is poisoned in a unit, that is, if they go to the doctor and they get a blood test and their level is over a certain number, and the number varies around the country, but if over that number, then the unit is what we call under order, and the property owner must abate. They're forced to abate once that has happened. So that's kind of it's kind of a backwards way to do it. We wait till the kid is sick and then we fix the problem. But that is, in reality, that is what happens most of the time.
Yeah, and actually it makes sense what you were saying, because in the area that I'm at, there's not a lot of really old homes like probably in New England, and there just aren't. They're newer. So even if they're older, it's more 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is older for the area that I mostly sell. So
not 1700.
Yeah, not 17. I mean, I have sold a few, but there's not very many in our area at all. They're extremely rare. So now that you're saying that, as far as the regional thing, that makes more sense. That people just aren't as worried about it because they're aren't as that age of homes in my area. But I had a client that I was listing their house, and the house was built in the 70s. It was built in the 80s. It was built after 1978. This was about 2 years ago. And it was just a little rambler. The home inspector did a water test, not a lead-based paint test, did a water test, pulled tap water from this kitchen sink, and also pulled water from the a hall bathroom. That it turns out the hall bathroom was rarely ever used. It was just a couple, but they had no children. And so the water sample was never submitted from the kitchen. It was submitted from the hall bath. I got a call from the agent, and the agent said, "Oh, my buyer wants to pull out of this contract because the house has lead in the pipes, in the water." And I said, "Well, this is, crazy. This is, a house built in the 80s. It's in great condition. These aren't even old pipes, let alone, you know what I mean? Any kind of lead paint either in the property." So I looked at the test, and it said where the water source was from. It said in the kid's bath. And I knew right away that was a false negative. because, and it turns out it was, long story short, I went ahead and called a technician from the lab, had them come out, pull another sample that was done properly. And then what had happened was the water had sat in those pipes for days and days, if not weeks and months, because there's just a couple who never used that bathroom. And that then the lead from the pipes was sitting in there and wasn't moving as it should be when you take an accurate test, which I'm sure you're totally familiar with. So long story short, thankfully, it was taken again properly, and it did not have lead in it. So it is one of those things that it really made me realize a lot of people, including realtors, don't always understand that these are, where the source comes from, how to properly test for lead. So is that something that you teach people, including home inspectors or people like that? Is that part of your certification?
It's interesting that you ask that, because actually home inspectors and lead inspectors are quite different. It's unusual for us to have a person who has both certifications. So unfortunately, the realtors and the buyers, for the most part, are dealing with two inspectors here. They're dealing with a home inspector, but that person is not certified usually to check for lead. But the lead inspectors they do both. Actually, they are certified to do paint, dust, soil, and water. So typically we do two water samples for exactly the reason you're describing. We do a first draw sample and we do a free flow sample after it's been running about 15 minutes or so, to make very sure that it's coming from, the well in some parts or the city water supply. And we compare the two. And the reason we do that is because that way we know if there's something in the pipes or in the faucet. Sometimes it's just a matter of cleaning the inside of that faucet. Sometimes that just got contaminated with some dust or something, and then the sample will come out fine. And otherwise, at least we know to let people know, just let the water run. You're fine. If at some point you want to replace all the plumbing, that's fine. But this is not a reason to do that.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense, because that would have totally derailed the settlement, the transaction, the sale. And it would have been unfortunate because it wasn't even accurate. So it is something that there seems to be a need for, just in general. Lead, whether it's in water or lead-based paint, more information. So I really am glad that we're having this topic, even though it's not a fun kind of topic. It is, I would consider, more of a heavy topic, but certainly very important. So how do you, now, I know you also wrote a book recently, right? You have a book that's available about parents. What's the title of your...
Yeah, so I have two books currently available on Amazon. This children's book, as you mentioned, which is called Skylar Learns About Lead Poisoning. And we chose the name Skylar because it could be either a boy or a girl. And it's the child comes home from school and says, "Hey, Mom, look what I learned today. I learned about lead poisoning. And here are 5 pictures of different places where we might be able to find lead. Let me show them to you, and you tell me where you think the lead is." And the pictures include things like mini blinds and water and pottery and toys and, places other than the old paint in your home. And the answer, as you go through, as Skylar explains to Mom, is that it could be, it could be in any of these, because it depends on what country they came from and what the regulations were there, and it depends on the deterioration of the paint and so forth. And so it's really, although it's a child explaining it, it's very easy to read and it's big colorful pictures, it's really written more for mom and dad to learn from it than for children. But it's very cute. It's in the children's book section. And then the second one is the beginning of a new series. My work is largely centered around the fact that we overly complicate the whole lead problem. We make it difficult for people to get inspections. They're expensive. There aren't that many people certified. We have federal regulations about contractors or landlords anybody who's working in a house built before 1978 is supposed to have this training and certification. And sometimes that conflicts with the local ordinances. And so there's state regulations, there's federal regulations. It just gets confusing for people. So my work is largely centered around simplifying. Let's make it easier for folks. So I have a series I'm writing called Lead Paint Clear and Simple. And the first one of the series is already out and available now. It's called A Parent's 5-Step Guide to Lead Poisoning. And it says, there's a lot of background and information, and you can read about that if you want. That's the first 40 pages or so of the book. And then the last 10 pages here are the 5 action steps you can take right now that will make a difference for your child. And I started with the parents because I wanted to address the safety issue. But I'm already most of the way through with a book for contractors, which is really about the same thing, a contractor's 5-step guide to lead poisoning, which is really about how to keep themselves safe. That is, not to poison themselves. I deal with a lot of lead poisoned adults as well. And also how to make sure that they limit their liability. They're not leaving behind this poisonous dust that's, poisoning kids, and that then will cause them to have problems, to be sued or whatever later. And then the next one will be for landlords, and the next one will be for realtors.
Wow.
So.
Well, that's so interesting. So the parents' guide is the first one, and that's the one that you have out now on Amazon. That's so interesting.
That's right.
I like that you're doing that for all the different industries involved in housing and so forth. If you have a house that does then have lead-based paint that's identified, how do you abate that? What are the most common ways to mitigate it?
So there's really two different ways of looking at it. You could abate, which means the complete and permanent removal or covering of the lead paint, but you also can just manage it as in a lead safe way and live in the house safely. Most of us grew up in houses with lead paint, and more children live safely in houses with lead paint than get sick. But it's a question of how you handle it. So you'd have to keep it intact. That is, paint over it frequently with regular old latex paint. Doesn't have to be anything fancy or expensive, but just to keep it sealed in. And also to be careful about the way that you clean. When people clean with brooms and mops, they just spread the stuff around. So we want to use HEPA Vax, which is a vacuum that just has a really fine filter. So it filters out that tiny, tiny dust. And also we want to work with disposable rags. So people think Swiffer, something you throw away rather than a sponge that's reusable. But actually it could be as simple as wet paper towels. It's just something that you throw away rather than, continue to spread the dust around. So the cleaning and continuing to keep it intact and keep the painting down, that's probably 90% of what I do with my landlord clients. That and regular inspections so that we get in that unit maybe every 3 months to make sure that the paint is not breaking down or deteriorating anywhere. And if it is, we paint it.
Wow.
So it's really a lot of basic.
Wow.
I'm
surprised. Yeah, that seems every 3 months you have to go in and do an assessment. Seems like
you don't have to, but that's what I recommend so that they stay ahead of it and don't get into issues with liability. Particularly, you get to know your tenants. If you have tenants that maybe are a little rougher on it because they have a lot of children or they play a lot of games or whatever it is that happens in the house that might, deteriorate the paint faster. It depends on the situation. But then sometimes you do need to fully abate, and sometimes you want to, because that's the best thing, just to get it out of there and never have to think about it again. Mm-hmm. And then you need a contractor who has got an abatement certification. They have to be lead abatement certified. Means they've taken a 4-day class and they've been tested at the state and the national level. They have to take an EPA test as well as a test in your state, whatever state they're working in. And they've had a lot of training and they have to pay a lot of insurance. Their liability is high. So they typically cost quite a bit. So usually we want to do as much as we can, sort of in the renovation realm. And then if you get to the point where you want to or need to fully abate, you make that choice and you do it maybe between tenants if you have an apartment building so that you get it done, quickly and you're not working around a lot of stuff and a lot of children. Mm-hmm. And then you have a lead safe place to move forward. And abatement is in the New England area anyway is a big business. There's a lot of people doing it and it's they're in demand. You can't get an abatement contractor. You have to wait quite a while. Wow. Because there just aren't enough of them.
Because you have also so many old houses. Right.
Also, the laws are changing. We have a federal law now that says anyone who disturbs paint in a house built before 1978 has to have some training. So that's everywhere in the country. And most states have additional requirements for abatement. And now they're starting to do mandatory testing. I have not seen testing of houses mandated, but the testing of the children is mandated. So in New England now, we test the kids at age 1 and age 2 at their pediatric visits. And if their level is too high, then the state's going to be looking to whoever owns that property to do something to mediate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I bought an investment property last year, and the age of the home was undetermined because it
Mm,
was built somewhere probably around 1920. It was, it was, there was no actual knowledge of the true age of the home. Now, it had been on the tax record, it showed that the house was built in 1988, and that's only because the original structure, the former owner had gone up on the property and then redid the property on the lower level as well. So
mm,
I did have it lead based paint tested, lead tested. And
mm-hmm.
I think it was like $700 or so. It wasn't cheap.
Yeah.
But
Right.
the lady came in and she had like some kind of gun thing that
Yeah.
she would, put up against the drywall all
Mm-hmm.
throughout the house and the windowsills. And I don't remember about the windows, but all over the place. And so she would get readings. And thankfully, there was no lead found in the house. So I didn't have to worry about
Great.
any yeah, which really surprised me just because the lower level, it had some really cool, kind of more ornate woodworking. It also has extremely high ceilings. So I really thought that, that there was a chance that was, I mean, thank God there wasn't. But so that's one of those things that if it had been found, then I mean, I guess you would recommend a contractor that has a certification to deal with
Right.
properly
Yep.
with lead.
So that's very common. The gun you're describing is called an XRF, and what it really does is it shoots X-rays into the walls. It's very interesting because lead stops X-rays. So when you go to the dentist and they put that heavy apron on you, it's because they don't want the X-rays to get to your heart and lungs and so forth. And that apron is a lead apron. The
Hmm.
same technology works on the wall. When they shoot X-rays into the wall, if it encounters lead, even if it's 5, 6, 8 layers deep, it's going to find the lead and bounce a signal back that says, here's lead, it's this deep. We found this much lead this deep. And those guns are very expensive, in the neighborhood of $20,000, $30,000. So the people who use them, charge a lot of money for
Mm-hmm.
them to come out to your house. So that's pretty typical, 5, 6, 700, depending on the size of the house. And if it were an apartment building, it might be 4 or 5 per unit. And then they give you a full report. You probably got many pages in your
Mm-hmm.
report. And if you're lucky, it goes the way yours did, and it says 00 everywhere. But if the numbers are higher, then those are the areas you have to disclose to the tenant or the buyer that there's lead in those areas, and also that you would want to abate. You would either cover them, and you don't have to take them out. You can cover them permanently. Sheetrock is an abatement technique, for instance, as long as it's sealed. There's no places that the lead dust can get out.
Mm-hmm. So is it more and more common, or as far as people getting the proper, I don't know, abatement isn't the right word, but the proper correction of it or remediation of it? Is that more and more common? More people are aware of it? Is that what the trends are, or is it just
Definitely.
regional?
No, definitely. You know what? I think Flint, Michigan made a big difference in that area. That was in the news and we all heard about it so much that it really raised people's awareness. And so now we're seeing pretty much every state in the country is starting to make some changes. We still don't have very many states that require testing of the kids. That's in process. A lot of states are changing right now. They're starting to go through that process. All of New England now, we've mandated testing pretty much. There's areas, still working and talking about it in the rest of the country, but I think it's going to continue to be a problem. And of course, as the paint deteriorates more, it's not going to get better. It's getting older. So as it deteriorates more, we're going to see more and more of that. And people are very vocal about it now. We had a local case here where the landlord ended up paying a $700,000 settlement. So
Wow.
it's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And we had a realtor who was in Buffalo, New York. Maureen Walchek, I believe was her name. It was 2017. She was sentenced to a $100,000 fine and a year in jail for not disclosing that, the seller had told her there was lead and somehow it didn't make it through to the buyer. And the buyer moved in with young children and the children got poisoned. So it did come back in that
Wow.
case to the realtor. So I think, it's starting to get serious for everybody. And that's why I've been doing videos and also little, ebooks specific to each industry because it's different. The realtor has a different take on it than the contractor or than the parent. And although we might all be parents and we might look at it, in with 2 or 3 different hats, still the focus is different.
Yeah, here in Maryland, we have an addendum. So if the property is built prior to 1978, then we put the addendum in the contract, and the seller then has to initial to either acknowledge that they are aware of lead-based paint, and if they have reports, or if they're not aware, most of them will say they're not aware of any lead-based paints in their home, and they don't have any reports. And then the buyer has to sign that, acknowledge that. So there is an acknowledgement of, any latent information that the seller might know. They would have to disclose that. But I'm sure that does sound like something that, you could really come back on if you didn't disclose.
Yeah, they're changing that form here in New England so that you're no longer able to say that you don't know. So you either have to say, I've had it tested and I know there's no lead, or we assume there is because it's pre-78. So it's starting to change the tone quite a bit here. Now, again, it's regional, I know. So.
So what about, I know your TEDx talk, what fascinated me about this topic with you is that you talk about, in your TEDx talk, new homes. You talk about lead in new homes. Why would anybody who has a house built in 2010, or my house was built in 2004, why would we even be thinking about lead-based paint? It's not old enough.
Right, absolutely. Unfortunately, this little bit of tiny dust that we were talking about that gets created, it travels. It travels on the wind, and it also travels on us. So the question is not really where you live. The question is, where do you go? So if you, for example, if you worked in an older building, you might very well be tracking lead dust home on your shoes at night. And I should preface this all by saying the amount that it takes to poison a child is smaller than a grain of sugar. As a matter of fact, the amount in a grain of sugar, that size lead would be enough to poison many children. So we're really talking tiny here. We're talking tiny, tiny, tiny bits. So what happens, and we've had many cases like this here in New England, is somebody might live in a house built in 2006, let's say, but they work in a place that is either an older building, or maybe it's automotive repair. Automotive paints contain lead, or a marina. Pretty much all of the boat paints contain lead because lead was really good at retarding mold and mildew. So it's still used. There's no law against using it in those areas, and it still is. It's still used in commercial buildings. Many of our schools are painted with lead. And so the children, even the children, can be bringing it home. Contractors, painters, anybody who works around old buildings and old paint, especially those who scrape and sand it, are likely to be carrying it home in their hair and their tools and their clothes, and those things come into the house along with any antiques that you might collect or anything that you might buy on eBay or in a yard sale that may have come from an older home. I had a case just recently where a client's child was poisoned by a picture frame in the playroom that had been handed down from grandma. And what I did with my TEDx talk was I brought in a half a dozen household items, set them up on a table on the stage, and tested them in front of the audience and showed how these things, which many of them have in their homes, contain lead. Wow. So it might even be something as simple as a piece of pottery or an old dish or a statue or a little, knickknack that's been handed down. So, and certainly if you have a home workshop where you maybe, pick up old things and refinish them, that's a really dangerous situation, especially if the kids help you with that work. So what you're saying is grandma's heirlooms may be making you sick. That's right. That's right. Luckily, there's an easy little tool you can buy. It costs like $3 or so, depending on where you get it. And you can test these things yourself in your home. You don't need to hire someone to do it. The little items that I used in the talk, you can buy them on Amazon. A package of 8 of them costs $20, and you can test it yourself, and then you'll know what you're dealing with. And maybe just put those items out of the reach of the little ones. That's a really good tip. So you could go right on Amazon. You can buy lead paint or lead testing, I guess, not just even paint, but lead testing. I can give you the brand name if it's okay. I
Sure.
don't
Yeah. Oh,
work
yeah.
for them or anything, but there's only EPA has only recognized 2 kits as being effective, even though there are many out there. One of them is a kit called Lead Check, which is made by 3M. It's a little crayon-sized device, and that's the one that I used in the talk. And the other one that EPA has recognized is called D-Lead, and those are really the only 2 that have been, sort of vetted by the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S.
Well, that's really helpful information. That's it's fascinating. Well, I am just so glad that we had a chance to talk about this. And how can people find you to get more information about certifications and so forth, or your books?
Sure, great, thank you. The website for all of the training that we do is lead.edu, so it's www.lead-edu.info. But also, I'm very reachable, kate@kkirkwood.com, or you can find me at www.kkirkwood.com.
Well, that's fantastic. I tell you what, Kate, that's really great information, and I think I don't think anything that I would want to test, but that's something really helpful for even clients, in the future going forward. Just if there's some really old antiques and heirlooms and things, because I see that all the time in people's houses, and it sounds like it's not a bad idea to test, especially if you have little ones. So that's terrific.
Yeah, not suggesting you have to get rid of those lovely things. Just, maybe they go in a glass front shelf, or maybe they go up high for a few years.
Yeah, not be played with every day.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much. Well, this wraps up this episode of the Pitbull Patti Show, where we are keeping it real in real estate. Until next time, thanks, Kate.
Thank you.